a place where silence is never empty and every shadow hides a story. If you love unsettling mysteries, unsolved crimes, and stories that keep you awake long after the lights go out, make sure to subscribe and stay with us until the end. Tonight, we begin the story of the Widow of Blackthorn Lane, a case where love, grief, and death all circle around one question: accident, suicide, or murder. Now, let's step into the lane. Blackthorn Lane. Blackthorn Lane was the kind of street that looked unchanged for decades. Narrow, hemmed by tall hedges and leaning trees, its houses were small, their paint peeling, their windows shaded. Neighbors spoke in whispers, not voices. The place had a way of holding secrets. At number 42 stood the Holloway house, a modest two-story with a pale green door and shutters that rarely opened. Margaret Holloway lived there alone, a widow of 3 years, her husband Edward gone to what the town believed was a sudden heart attack. She was 54, private, and polite, the kind of woman people noticed only when she wasn't there. On March 14, 1996, the neighbors did notice. They realized the curtains hadn't moved in days. The mailbox sagged with unopened envelopes, and for the first time, the front garden looked abandoned, as if even the roses had stopped expecting her. The locked house. When police arrived that afternoon, they found the front door locked from the inside. No footprints in the garden, no broken windows, no forced entry. They broke the door open with one heavy shove. Inside, the house smelled faintly of lavender and dust. Everything was in order. Dishes stacked neatly, books lined in rows, photographs of Edward still standing watch on the mantel. And in the living room, Margaret Holloway sat slumped in her armchair, her head tilted forward as if she had dozed off, one hand resting against the armrest, the other limp on her lap. Beside her, a teacup sat on a small wooden table, its rim still stained dark. The teapot, decorated with faded blue flowers, stood half full. The liquid inside smelled faintly of mint. The scene was eerily peaceful, as though she had simply drifted away into sleep. The first report. The initial examination leaned toward the ordinary. No struggle, no wounds, no signs of violence. The doors and windows were secured from within. The report, written quickly and almost with relief, listed the cause as natural, a body giving out under the weight of time. The words were simple, clinical, final. But the silence of Blackthorn Lane carried more weight than that. Because in that quiet house, with the curtains drawn and the door locked, the first cracks in the story had already begun to show. The autopsy room. Margaret Holloway's body was brought to the county morgue the following morning. The coroner, Dr. Stephen Mallory, was a man more used to routine. Strokes, heart attacks, accidents from the farms that bordered the town. Nothing about Margaret's case at first seemed unusual. Her body showed no external trauma, no bruising, no scratches, nothing that spoke of violence. But it was protocol to test blood. Even in natural cases, Dr. Mallory drew samples, his hands steady, his mind already writing the word heart failure in his head. It was only hours later, when the chemical analysis returned, that his pen hovered still. The substance traces of digitalis, a cardiac glycoside, a drug derived from the foxglove plant, prescribed in small, precise doses to strengthen the heart. But in larger amounts, it did the opposite. In Margaret's blood, the concentration was more than therapeutic. It was toxic. Doctor. Mallory leaned back in his chair, staring at the paper. Digitalis was not an accident one stumbled into. It was measured, intentional, deliberate. Someone had given her too much, or she had taken it herself. The teacup. The detectives returned to the Holloway house with fresh eyes. They collected the teapot and cup from the side table, sealing them carefully. When tested, Both revealed the same compound. The tea had carried the poison. What once looked like a peaceful end in an armchair now looked like a calculated dose, swallowed slowly, washed down with mint leaves. The theories. The police sat around their oak table, the file growing thicker. Could be suicide, one said. She was lonely. Her husband dead. Maybe she wanted to follow. Another shook his head. Or someone slipped it in. Doors were locked, yes, but anyone could have dosed the tea before she drank. The silence in the room was heavy. Neither theory was comforting. The husband's shadow. It was then that someone remembered the husband, Edward Holloway, dead 3 years prior at 58 from a sudden heart attack. His death had been considered tragic but ordinary. Yet now, with digitalis on the table, whispers began. What if Edward hadn't died naturally either? The thought lodged itself in the investigation like a thorn. Blackthorn Lane at night. By evening, word had slipped into the neighborhood. Blackthorn Lane was not large, and secrets did not stay long behind curtains. Neighbors whispered on porches. She seemed fine, lonely, but not the type. Locked inside. How does someone get poison into a locked house? Maybe she let them in. Maybe she knew them. The house at number 42 stood dark, but people swore the windows looked back at them now, as though Margaret still sat inside. The case shifts. By the end of that week, the Holloway file no longer carried the word natural. It was reclassified, pending. And in its pages, for the first time, the words possible poisoning appeared. Searching the house again. After the toxicology results, detectives combed the Holloway residence a second time. What had once seemed like a tidy, ordinary home now looked different. Every drawer, every shelf, every shadow felt like it might hold a secret. In the back of a desk drawer, beneath old tax papers and yellowed letters, they found a small leather-bound notebook. Its cover was cracked with age, the spine nearly broken. Inside, neat but hurried handwriting filled the pages. The name on the first page, Edward Holloway. The diary. Edward had not been much of a writer, neighbors said, but grief does strange things to memory. The entries grew more erratic near the end, his words clipped, sentences unfinished. One line from his final weeks stood out like a bruise on pale skin. There is a third. He comes when I am gone. Margaret doesn't speak of him, but I see signs. A cup washed twice. A chair moved. The smell of smoke that isn't mine. Another entry, written shakily only days before his death, read, If I vanish, remember this. It wasn't my heart that failed me. It was trust. The weight of the words. The detectives sat in silence, the words heavy between them. The diary didn't prove murder, but it cast a shadow on Margaret's solitude. If Edward was right, then before his death there had been someone else, a man who came to Blackthorn Lane, unseen, unspoken of. And if Edward hadn't died of a heart attack. The neighbors' stories. Detectives returned to the lane, knocking on doors. Mrs. Leary, who lived 2 houses down, remembered odd things. I'd see cigarette smoke by the window when Edward was away. Margaret never smoked, at least not that I knew. Mr. Carver, a retired postman, recalled a figure slipping through the gate late at night. Tall man, always kept his collar up. Didn't know him, didn't belong here. Small details. Unconfirmed. But they aligned too neatly with Edward's diary. The whisper of motive. Whispers began. Had Margaret taken a lover after Edward's death? Had that same man returned years later, slipping poison into her tea? Or, more unsettling, had the lover existed before Edward died, just as Edward suspected? If so, then both deaths might trace back to the same shadow, The locked house. Reconsidered detectives circled back to the puzzle of the locked doors. If Margaret had taken the poison herself, it explained the locks. But if someone else had given it to her, then that person had to be trusted enough to be inside, to drink tea with her, to walk out quietly while she sat dying in her chair. Not a stranger, someone familiar, someone she might even have loved. The case darkens. The file on Margaret Holloway grew heavier. Now it contained not just her autopsy, but Edward's diary, a voice from the grave, warning of betrayal. The case no longer asked only how she died. It asked who the third man was, and whether he had already claimed 2 lives on Blackthorn Lane. Part 3 closes here. Edward's diary found, the chilling mention of a mysterious third man, and suspicion deepening that both deaths may be connected. The machine in the hall. The Holloway house was quiet when detectives returned for a third sweep, but technology sometimes held secrets the human eye missed. In the front hallway sat a beige answering machine, the kind with 2 small cassettes, one for outgoing, one for incoming. It had been plugged in, a faint red light still blinking. They rewound the tape and pressed play. Most messages were ordinary. A reminder from the pharmacy, a neighbor asking if Margaret wanted to attend a church supper, a telemarketer's drone. But the final recording froze the room. The voice. It lasted only 2 seconds. A man's voice, low and rasping, whispered 3 words. "It's done." No name, no context. Just that. And then silence. The reactions. The detectives replayed it again and again. The tone was not casual. It wasn't the sound of someone confirming an errand or finishing a chore. It was weighted, final, like the closing of a door. The timestamp showed the message had been left the night before Margaret was found. The implication was chilling. Whoever called knew what had happened, or what was about to happen. The neighbors' fears. When word of the tape reached Blackthorn Lane, unease deepened into dread. "I knew it," Mrs. Leary muttered from her porch. "That woman wasn't alone. Someone was with her that night." Mr. Carver, the old postman, shook his head. "I told you, a man in a coat, slipping in and out. They thought I was seeing things. Well, now you've got his voice." People began avoiding number 42 entirely. Children dared each other to touch the fence, then ran away, screaming. At night, the house seemed darker than the others, as though the whisper still clung to its walls. The police divide. Within the department, the case began to split opinions. Some argued it was suicide, that Margaret had poisoned herself, and the whispered call was some cruel prank. Others insisted it was murder, that the man Edward called the Third had finally claimed her. A few even suggested the unthinkable, that both deaths were linked, and Blackthorn Lane hid a serial hand. Edward's Shadow Grows detectives returned to Edward's diary, comparing its last pages with the message. "There is a third. He comes when I am gone. It's done." The 2 fragments, one written, one whispered, seemed to answer each other across time. Edward had warned, the caller had confirmed, and Margaret had died in the silence between. The unclassified death. By January 1997, the case remained unresolved. The official paperwork listed Margaret's death as pending. No charge, no closure, no clarity. Her husband's words, the poison in the tea, the whisper on the machine. 3 pieces of a puzzle that refused to lock together. And so the death of the widow of Blackthorn Lane remained unclassified. Accident, suicide, or murder. The only certainty was the silence. The weight of a whisper. The words "it's done" haunted every detective on the case. A whisper was not enough for charges, not even enough for a warrant, but it carried the weight of intent. If the voice belonged to Edward's third man, then the case was not about grief, not about loneliness. It was about betrayal and planning. The problem was, no one knew who that man was. The list of names detectives began building a list. They started with men known to Margaret, neighbors, old colleagues, acquaintances who had stopped by her home. Henry Talbot, the grocer who often delivered to the Holloway house. Reverend Cole, a local clergyman who had visited Margaret after Edward's funeral. Arthur Jennings, an old friend of Edward's, who some said visited even more often after Edward's death. Thomas Brandt, a tradesman who had repaired the Holloway's roof the year Edward died. Ordinary men, all with reasons to be near. Ordinary men, now burdened with suspicion. Gossip on Blackthorn Lane. The neighbors added fuel. Mrs. Leary, sharp-eyed, insisted she had once seen Margaret walking the garden with a man who wasn't Edward. Tall, dark coat, not her husband. That much I know. Another neighbor whispered about the Reverend. Too many visits. Too much time inside. People of God don't linger that way. The stories tangled together, and soon everyone had seen something, though none of it was clear. Margaret's reputation. Through it all, Margaret's memory twisted. Some described her as lonely, vulnerable, perhaps desperate for company. Others painted her as secretive, guarded, a woman who had cultivated privacy to hide something. Her dignity in death became another casualty of suspicion. The investigators divide. The detectives argued late into the night. One insisted it was Jennings, the family friend. Who better to slip inside unnoticed? Another pushed Brandt, the tradesman. Outsiders are always the ones. A third muttered about the Reverend. Too many whispers to ignore. But Sheriff Albright, the man overseeing the case, tapped Edward's diary on the table. You're all forgetting something, he said. Edward wrote about this before he died. He believed he was being replaced. That means whoever it was, Margaret trusted him enough to invite him in. The room fell silent. A knock at midnight. That week, as snow fell thick on the lane, Mrs. Leary swore she heard knocking at Margaret's door. Faint, 3 times. When she looked out, the house was empty, black as ever. But she told police anyway, her hands trembling around her teacup. Maybe he still comes back, she whispered. Maybe he's not done. The case grows colder. By the end of winter, no charges were filed. The names remained names. The whisper remained on tape. The diary remained in a folder. But something had changed. The people of Blackthorn Lane no longer spoke of Margaret as a victim alone. They spoke of a secret, a shadow she carried, a third man who might still walk their street. The old file. Edward Holloway's death, 3 years earlier, had been buried in the archives of the county records office. Acute myocardial infarction, the report read. A sudden heart attack. At 58, no one questioned it too closely. Edward had been under stress, after all. A heavy smoker, a man carrying weight he never quite shed after middle age. But now, with Margaret gone and poison in her blood, detectives pulled the file out again. The handwriting looked tired, the report brief. Too brief. Parallels Edward had died in his own armchair, at home. No sign of a struggle. No forced entry. No note of suspicion, much like Margaret. The symmetry chilled the investigators. 2 Holloways, both found in quiet chairs, both deaths seemingly natural, until you looked closer. The autopsy gap. Edward's body had never been fully autopsied. At the time, his age and medical history seemed enough to explain it. His doctor signed off on natural causes, but in hindsight, that decision looked careless. What if he was poisoned too? One detective asked aloud, his voice echoing in the small records room. The thought hung heavy. If Edward's blood had carried digitalis, no one would know now. His body had been cremated. The evidence was ash. The diary's warning. They turned again to Edward's words. There is a third. He comes when I am gone. Margaret doesn't speak, but I see the signs. If I vanish, remember this. It wasn't my heart that failed me. It was trust. The page now read less like paranoia, more like prophecy. Revisiting the suspects. With Edward back in the spotlight, the suspects looked different. Jennings, the family friend, close enough to Edward to visit often, close enough to Margaret to linger after. The Reverend, a man of comfort, present in grief, a trusted figure. The tradesman, less likely. But Edward had mentioned the smell of smoke, the shifting of objects. Someone had been there more than once. If Edward was right, the third man had been in the house before his death, and possibly after. The neighbor's memory. Mrs. Leary, asked again, remembered something new. Edward's last week alive. I heard shouting. A man's voice, not his. Margaret tried to quiet it, but the sound carried through the lane. When asked why she hadn't said so before, she looked down at her hands. Because in this place, she whispered, we don't go prying into the dead. The weight of silence. By the time detectives closed their notebooks, one truth felt heavier than all the rest. If Edward had not died naturally, then Margaret's death was not the beginning of a mystery. It was the continuation of one, and the third man had already outlived them both. Back to the hallway. The whisper had become an obsession. Detectives returned to the Holloway house with the answering machine sealed carefully in an evidence bag. The device was outdated, clunky, its tape reels fragile. But inside those thin strands of magnetic ribbon lay the only living clue in the case. They carried it to the lab, rewound it, and played it again. 2 seconds. One voice. It's done. The sound filled the sterile room, a ghost made of static. Forensic ears. The county called in a specialist, Dr. Helen Moritz, a forensic linguist. She sat in a soundproof booth, headphones pressed to her ears, listening over and over, analyzing tone, pitch, breath. Her notes were clinical but unsettling. Male, approximately 40 to 55 years old. Regional accent faint but present. Midlands inflection. Voice rough, possibly a smoker. Whispered but not strained. Confident, deliberate. Her conclusion? This was not the sound of panic. It was the sound of completion. The comparison detectives began collecting voice samples quietly. They asked neighbors casual questions, lingered longer on suspects, even recorded men at church under pretense of community announcements. The tapes piled up. Jennings, the Reverend, the grocer, the tradesman. They fed them one by one into the analyzer. The machine couldn't prove guilt, but it could highlight similarities. And one name emerged. The near match. Arthur Jennings, Edward's old friend. The man who had been at the Holloway house often before and after Edward's death. The one neighbors said visited more once Margaret was alone. The software flagged his recording at 72% similarity. Not a match, not evidence enough, but close. Too close to ignore. The sheriff's dilemma. Sheriff Albright sat in his office late that night, Jennings's file spread before him. A man of standing in town. A man trusted by both Edward and Margaret. Could he have been the third man? The diary, the whisper, the pattern. It all pointed his way. But without proof, the sheriff knew pressing Jennings too hard would backfire. In a small town, accusations spread faster than truth. A quiet encounter. That same week, Jennings himself walked into the station with a casserole dish in his hands. "Thought you boys could use a meal," he said warmly. His smile was easy, his voice calm, steady. Detectives froze. They had just spent hours replaying his tone. Now it filled the room in real time. No tape, no static. And for a moment, it was impossible not to hear the whisper in every syllable. The uneasy silence. When he left, the dish sitting steaming on the table, no one touched it. One detective muttered, "It's him." Another shook his head. Or it's the river in our ears. Once you hear a whisper, you start hearing it everywhere. The sheriff said nothing, only staring at the dish, as though it were an offering. Jennings, the familiar. Arthur Jennings had always been part of the Holloway's orbit. In photographs from church socials, he stood beside Edward, their smiles easy, their suits pressed. Neighbors recalled him helping repair the fence, carrying groceries, even trimming hedges at the Holloway home. Edward had called him brother more than once. So when Edward died, Jennings's presence around Margaret seemed natural, a family friend stepping in, offering comfort. But grief often blurs lines, and comfort can wear other masks. Whispers of closeness, Mrs. Leary, the ever-watchful neighbor, remembered Margaret and Jennings sitting together in the garden one summer evening. "She laughed," she said. "Not the polite kind, the kind you laugh when you're not alone anymore." Others noticed he lingered late into the night, leaving only when lights in the house went dark. For years, no one questioned it. But now, with Margaret dead, the whispers grew sharper. The diary revisited Edward's words in his final weeks suddenly carried more weight. There is a third. He comes when I am gone. Margaret doesn't speak, but I see signs. If I vanish, remember this. It wasn't my heart that failed me. It was trust. Detectives lined those words beside the suspicion surrounding Jennings. The shape of the third man began to fit. But fitting was not proving. Jennings's reputation. The trouble was, Jennings's reputation worked against suspicion. He was known in town as steady, generous, a man of means who helped with church repairs and gave to the school fund. Accusing him without evidence risked not only the case but the sheriff's standing. Still, detectives noted the cracks, his easy charm, his long evenings at Margaret's home, and the fact that he seemed always present where the Holloways were most vulnerable. A town divided. The town itself began to fracture. Some defended him. Jennings would never. He's been nothing but good to this community. Others sharpened their doubts. Good men don't whisper "it's done" into a widow's telephone. The split wasn't just about Jennings, it was about trust itself. Whether the community could believe its own face of respectability, or whether evil wore a friendly smile. Jennings under question. Finally, Jennings was invited to the station. Not accused, not charged, just asked. He sat across from detectives, his posture easy, his voice smooth. Edward was my friend. Margaret, too. I did what anyone would have done. I helped. You're looking for shadows that aren't there. When played the tape, he leaned back, brows furrowed. That's not me. I don't whisper. And if you think it sounds like me, that's because whispers make everyone sound the same. The detectives noted his composure, but also the smallest thing, the way his hand tapped the table, slow and steady, like marking time. 3 taps. Then silence. Aftermath. When Jennings walked out of the station, the sheriff watched him go, jaw tight. One detective muttered, "We almost had him." Another shook his head. "Or he almost had us." The line between guilt and innocence blurred, and Blackthorn Lane sank deeper into its fog. Letters in a drawer. Detectives returned to the Holloway house once more, this time focusing less on crime scenes and more on Margaret's private belongings. In the bedroom dresser, beneath folded scarves and old perfume bottles, they found a bundle of letters tied with ribbon. Most were from Edward, written decades earlier. Love notes, reminders from his business trips, lines of devotion. But among them were several loose sheets in Margaret's hand, not diary entries, but fragments of thoughts, never mailed. One read, "I am not alone, but I cannot say who is with me. Edward saw shadows and called them betrayal. I only saw kindness. Does that make me guilty?" The tone of confession. The letters were not dated, but the handwriting matched her later years. The words suggested companionship, perhaps affection, but also shame. Margaret had not written the name of the man. She had circled around it, as though secrecy itself was part of the bond. "He brings warmth to this house," one note said, "but warmth cannot stay without fire. I fear what fire consumes." The detectives underlined that line. Routines revisited. Neighbors remembered Margaret's quiet patterns. Fridays at the market, Sundays at church, long walks in the evening, always returning just before dark. But Mrs. Leary swore she had once seen her pause at the corner, speaking low with a man who stood in the shadow of a tree. "I waved," she said. She didn't wave back. She looked guilty, like I'd caught her stealing. Conflicting images. The letters painted Margaret as conflicted. Lonely, yes, but not simply vulnerable. She may have chosen companionship, even in secrecy. The question was whether that choice had become fatal. Had the third man been comfort, or had he been poison in her cup? The detectives debate. In the station, files stacked high, the team argued. One detective believed Margaret had knowingly kept the man in her life, protecting him, even after Edward's suspicions. Another believed she had been deceived, that the man had fed her kindness only to mask cruelty. Sheriff Albright closed the file and shook his head. Doesn't matter what she believed. What matters is what killed her. The silence of the house. Each search of number 42 Holloway Lane ended the same way, with the house sitting quiet, curtains drawn, air heavy. Some officers swore they heard faint clicks from the answering machine, though it had been long since unplugged. Others said the letters left behind felt more like warnings than confessions. What was clear was this: Margaret had not lived as alone as people thought. She had secrets folded into drawers, whispered at corners, and poured into her tea. The case deepens. The calendar detectives pinned a calendar to the wall of the station, marking off Margaret Holloway's final week with red ink. They filled the days with what neighbors remembered, what receipts revealed, what routine suggested. It wasn't much, but it was enough to see gaps. Sunday, March 10th. Margaret attended church, dressed in gray, her hair pinned neatly. She sat alone in the back pew. The Reverend remembered her taking communion quietly, eyes down. Mrs. Leary swore she saw a man waiting at the gate when Margaret returned home. A tall figure, coat collar turned up. But she couldn't swear it wasn't her imagination. Monday, March 11th. A grocery delivery. Henry Talbot, the grocer, left a bag at her door. He claimed she only exchanged a polite thank you, but the receipt showed more than her usual order: an extra packet of mint tea. Margaret had always bought chamomile. Tuesday, March 12th. Margaret was seen walking the lane at dusk. A neighbor's child remembered her stopping at the corner, speaking softly to someone out of sight. The child said the man smoked. He saw the glow of the cigarette. Margaret did not smoke. Wednesday, March 13th, silence. No one saw her leave the house. The curtains stayed drawn. But that evening, at 9:37 p.m., the answering machine recorded the whisper, "It's done." The timestamp was precise. Thursday, March 14th. The house stayed still. Curtains closed. No movement. By afternoon, neighbors grew uneasy. Police forced the door and found her in the chair, tea cooling beside her. The inconsistencies. The detectives circled the gaps in red, the unusual mint tea, the cigarette glow, the whisper on the machine the night before. Each detail pointed not to solitude, but company. Margaret had not been alone in her last days. The question of trust. The locked door still troubled the investigation. "She let him in," one detective muttered. "She poured the tea, maybe for both of them. He left before she died. Or while she was dying, locked the door behind him. Maybe she trusted him enough to hand him the key." The sheriff said nothing, but in his silence, the truth pressed heavier. Margaret's death looked less like despair and more like betrayal. Blackthorn Lane at night. As word spread of the reconstructed timeline, the lane grew quieter. People hurried past number 42 without looking up. Children were forbidden to play near the fence. The house no longer looked empty. It looked watched. The case tightens. By the end of March, detectives knew more than before, but not enough. Margaret had been alive on Tuesday, quiet on Wednesday, and dead by Thursday. Someone had walked the space between those days with her. But who? Jennings, the family friend, the Reverend with his quiet visits, or another man, one who had left nothing but smoke and whispers. The timeline narrowed the field, but it also deepened the dread. A small detail. The detectives had seen poison cases before, but rarely did the story begin with something as simple as a change in tea. Margaret Holloway had been loyal to chamomile for years, soothing, predictable, a widow's comfort in a quiet house. Yet, in her final order, she had asked for mint. And mint, as the coroner confirmed, was the very tea laced with digitalis. The question wasn't just who gave her poison, it was who gave her mint. Interview with the grocer. Henry Talbot was a stout man in his late 50s, cheeks red from years of cold mornings hauling produce. His shop on Main Street smelled of sawdust and oranges. When detectives asked about the order, he rubbed his hands nervously on his apron. "She phoned it in, just like always," he said. "Chamomile, sugar, flour, the usual, and mint tea, clear as day. She said it twice." "Twice?" the sheriff asked. Talbot nodded. "Yes, almost like she wanted to make sure I wrote it down." The unease. It didn't sit right. Margaret had never bought mint tea before. Why change now? Detectives pressed him harder. Could someone else have called in the order pretending to be her? Talbot hesitated, his eyes darting. "Well, I suppose I've known her voice for years, but over the phone, anyone could sound different." The line crackled. "I thought she sounded tired. Grief does that, you know." He swallowed, then added, "Besides, I didn't see her when I delivered it. I left the bag on the porch. Door was shut. Curtains drawn." Seeds of doubt. If Margaret herself had placed the order, it suggested intent, perhaps suicide. If someone else had placed it in her name, it suggested manipulation, murder. And either way, the bag had been left unseen, unclaimed in the moment. Anyone could have stepped onto the porch, taken what they needed, tampered with what was inside. The grocer's reputation. Henry Talbot had no history, no record, no rumors. He was solid, dependable, known to all. But in Blackthorn Lane, even solid men grew shadows. One neighbor whispered that she had once seen him linger at Margaret's gate, waiting too long after a delivery. Another insisted he had been too quick to defend himself when questioned. The town, hungry for answers, turned suspicion toward him. The sheriff's thoughts. Back at the station, Sheriff Albright tapped his pen against the report. She either ordered mint tea because she wanted it, or someone ordered it for her. Either way, that's the cup that killed her. He looked around the table, his eyes hard. We're not chasing ghosts anymore. We're chasing the man who wanted her dead. The house at number 42. That night, the Holloway house stood silent again. The porch where the tea had been delivered seemed darker, as though it remembered what had been set there. A paper bag holding sugar, flour, and death. And inside, the air seemed heavier, as though the widow's final sip still lingered. The shepherd Reverend Nathaniel Cole had been the parish priest of St. Agnes for nearly 2 decades. He was known as steady, mild, his sermons soft rather than thunderous. After Edward Holloway's funeral, he had visited Margaret often, at first weekly, then more sporadically, though still enough that the neighbors noticed. At the time, it was seen as kindness, a shepherd tending to a widow. But kindness wears many masks. The interview detectives met him in his study, where the air smelled of old books and candle wax. The Reverend folded his hands calmly on the desk. "I visited Margaret," he admitted without hesitation. She was alone. She needed comfort, prayer, conversation. What else would a man of God do? "Did she ever confide in you?" one detective asked. He paused, then nodded. "She spoke of loneliness, yes, of shadows in the house. She said Edward's presence lingered, not always kindly." The shadows. The detectives pressed. Shadows? Did she mean another person? The Reverend's gaze drifted. "She didn't name anyone, but she spoke as though watched. I told her solitude breeds ghosts of the mind, but she insisted it was real." The words unsettled the room. The tape. When asked about the whisper on the answering machine, Reverend Cole closed his eyes briefly. "A wicked thing," he said, "but not mine. I do not whisper in shadows." His voice, though calm, was deeper than expected, enough that the detectives exchanged glances. They would have to compare his recording, too. The suspicions outside the church, townsfolk were already muttering. "Too many visits," one parishioner whispered. "And always at night. What business does a priest have sitting with a widow after dark?" Another countered, "He's a man of God. If you can't trust him, who can you trust?" But the lines had blurred. A priest offering prayers could look, from another angle, like a man offering more. The Reverend alone. That evening, as he locked the church, the Reverend lingered at the door. He looked down Blackthorn Lane, where Margaret's house sat in silence. He whispered something under his breath. The constable who saw him couldn't hear the words. But he swore later that the Reverend's tone was not prayer. It was closer to grief or guilt. The file grows back at the station. The Holloway file thickened. Jennings, the family friend, Talbot, the grocer, now Reverend Cole. Each man trusted, each man close, each man now shadowed by suspicion. The sheriff shut the folder with a sigh. "We've got too many suspects," he muttered, "and just one widow left to tell us the truth. But she's not talking." The return to Jennings. Arthur. Jennings had walked out of the station with confidence, casserole dish in hand, his reputation intact. But suspicion lingers longer than charm. Detectives decided to dig deeper, beyond whispers and voices. They wanted numbers, money, paper, signatures that couldn't be smiled away. The bank records. Margaret's financial records told a quiet story. For years, her spending was modest. Groceries, church tithes, gas for the old Ford. But in the months after Edward's death, her bank showed steady withdrawals. Small at first, then larger. Cash. Always in cash. The trail didn't show where it went, but the timing matched Jennings's visits. The ledger. At the Holloway home, in Edward's old desk, they found a leather ledger. Margaret's handwriting filled most pages. Household expenses, bills paid, groceries tallied. But on 3 entries, the handwriting changed. Arthur's, next to sums of money, larger than groceries, too large to be dismissed. The question, when confronted, Jennings's easy smile flickered. Yes, I helped with finances. Margaret wasn't good with numbers. She asked me to step in after Edward died. That's all. Why were you writing in her ledger? The sheriff asked. Because she asked me to, Jennings replied, a little sharper now. Do you want me punished for kindness? The inheritance. The detectives dug further. Edward's will had left Margaret the house and modest savings. No mention of Jennings. No connection. But witnesses remembered Jennings helping organize after Edward's funeral. Papers, accounts, insurance. He had been in the house sorting through drawers when Margaret was at her weakest. If trust was a door, Jennings had walked through it with ease. The Town Reacts news of the ledger spread quickly. Money changes everything, one neighbor muttered. If he had his hands in her purse, what else did he have his hands in? Another insisted it proved nothing. Margaret was kind. She leaned on people. Jennings was just helping. But suspicion sticks harder than proof, and Jennings's name grew darker with each retelling. The sheriff's thoughts. Sheriff Albright sat with the ledger late into the night, his eyes fixed on the entries. The ink was faint, but the implication bold. Edward had warned of betrayal. Margaret had left fragments of confession. And now Jennings's handwriting sat inside their home, touching their money, just as his voice brushed close to the whisper on tape. The sheriff tapped the page, whispering to himself, if it wasn't money, what was it? Blackthorn Lane at night. That evening, Jennings's car was seen idling at the corner of the lane, lights off, engine running. He sat there for nearly 20 minutes before driving away. No one knew why, but in a town already drowning in suspicion, the sight was enough to set tongues wagging for weeks. The old death. Reopened, Edward Holloway's file had gathered dust for 3 years, stamped myocardial infarction and closed without question. But with Margaret gone, and digitalis confirmed in her system, detectives dug through every brittle page once more. The parallels chilled them. Both deaths had taken place inside the Holloway home. Both victims found in armchairs. Both declared natural at first glance. And both, perhaps, betrayed by trust. The doctor's memory. They spoke again with Dr. Whitmore, the town physician who had signed Edward's death certificate. Now in his 60s, his voice wavered as he recalled that March night. He was pale, sweating. Margaret said he'd been unwell for days. Chest pains. I didn't see reason to doubt it. Men his age, it happened suddenly. Did you test for toxins? One detective asked. Dr. Whitmore looked down. No. We don't test the dead when the living give us answers. He was cremated the next week. A gap, now unbridgeable. Witnesses. Remember, neighbors were pressed again about Edward's final days. Mr. Carver, the retired postman, recalled seeing him walking slower, holding his chest. But Mrs. Leary remembered something else. The night before he died, there was shouting. A man's voice. Not Edward's. Margaret trying to calm him. I didn't tell anyone. It wasn't my place. That silence had buried more than gossip. It might have buried motive. The smell of smoke. Edward's diary entry returned to mind. The smell of smoke that isn't mine. He had written of chairs moved, cups washed twice, signs of another presence. Now, detectives noticed one detail they had overlooked. Edward was a smoker himself, but he favored a pipe, cherry tobacco. The cigarette smell was different, acrid, foreign, just like the child's memory of seeing the glow of a cigarette near Margaret days before her death. The same shadow, perhaps, spanning years. The pattern. Edward dies suddenly. Declared natural. Margaret dies quietly. declared natural until poison proves otherwise. 2 deaths, same house, same air of trust turned sour, and maybe the same man, slipping in and out unseen. The sheriff's realization. Sheriff Albright closed Edward's file with a grim shake of his head. "We missed it," he muttered. "We let a killer walk away 3 years ago." And he came back to finish what he started. One detective asked quietly, "Then why wait 3 years?" The sheriff's reply was slower, colder. "Because grief makes a widow lonely, and lonely widows invite company." Blackthorn Lane, at night. That evening, the Holloway house seemed to lean heavier into its silence. 2 armchairs in the living room, both had held death now. Some neighbors swore they saw a figure standing at the window, though the house was empty. Others said the smell of smoke drifted faintly from the chimney, though the fireplace hadn't been lit in months. The widow's silence. Margaret Holloway had not been a woman who spoke much to neighbors. She gave polite nods, kept her curtains drawn, and filled her time with books and gardening. But detectives now wondered, had her silence been grief or protection? If Edward's diary was his warning, perhaps Margaret had left her own, hidden in plain sight. The locked cabinet. In her bedroom, a cabinet stood against the wall. At first glance, it was filled with harmless keepsakes, framed photographs, porcelain figurines, a jar of buttons, a folded shawl. But behind the shawl was a small tin box. Inside lay scraps of paper, folded and refolded until the edges frayed. Fragments. The scraps weren't letters. They were pieces of Margaret's own handwriting, torn from journals or written on the backs of envelopes. Fragments of thought, half confessions. "He returns even when I don't ask." Edward was right. I didn't want to believe him. If kindness comes with poison, then what is cruelty? And one, written in shaking hand. He promised I'd never be alone. But promises are chains. The detective's realization. The scraps suggested Margaret knew, or at least suspected, that someone in her life was dangerous. She had lived with that knowledge quietly, unable or unwilling to speak it aloud. "Why not go to the police?" one detective muttered. The sheriff answered grimly, "Because she trusted him, and fear wears the same face as love when you're alone." The photo album. Beside the tin box sat an album. Most photographs were old. Edward smiling at the garden, Margaret beside him. But in the final pages, tucked between photos, were newer images. Shots from church gatherings, town events. And in the background of several, Arthur Jennings, always near, always watching. His presence was subtle but constant, like a shadow never quite leaving the frame. The sheriff's doubt. Sheriff Albright studied the scraps and photos late into the night. Margaret had not written Jennings's name. She had not identified the third man. But she had left the pattern. The sheriff whispered to himself, "She wanted us to know. She just couldn't bring herself to say it." The house holds its breath. That evening, number 42 Blackthorn Lane seemed to hold its breath. Detectives locked the cabinet again, but some swore the air of the room grew colder afterward, as though Margaret's secrets didn't want to be sealed. Neighbors claimed they saw a light flicker in the bedroom window. When they looked again, it was gone. The decision. By mid-April, the case had stalled. Too many suspects, too many fragments of truth. But Arthur Jennings' name kept returning. In Edward's diary, in Margaret's hidden scraps, in the background of photographs, in the ledger entries, and above all, in the whisper. The sheriff decided it was time to confront him directly. The voice test detectives invited Jennings back under the guise of clarifying a few details. He arrived neatly dressed, his usual calm smile in place, as though the shadow of suspicion hadn't touched him. They sat him before a tape recorder and asked him to read a short passage aloud. Ordinary words, chosen carefully to echo the cadence of the whisper. "The work is finished." "It is done." Jennings complied, his voice steady, unhurried. Then they played the recording back beside the whisper. The room grew heavy, the tones aligned too closely. Same rasp, same cadence, only louder in one, hushed in the other. Jennings chuckled softly. "You're chasing echoes. Any man can sound like any other in a whisper." But his hand twitched slightly on the table, the only betrayal his composure allowed. The confrontation. The sheriff slid Margaret's scraps across the desk. Jennings read them, eyes flicking briefly at each line. "He returns even when I don't ask. Edward was right. I didn't want to believe him." Jennings placed them down gently. Margaret was grieving, writing nonsense. You cannot hold the ramblings of a lonely widow as evidence against a man's life. "Then why," one detective asked, "does your handwriting appear in her ledger?" For the first time, Jennings didn't smile. The town divides. News of the confrontation spread quickly, though nothing official was released. Some insisted it proved Jennings's guilt. Others said it was harassment, a witch hunt against a generous man. At the diner, voices grew sharp. "If he's innocent, why does his shadow sit in every corner of this story?" And yet others whispered, "Maybe the real killer wants him blamed." Suspicion became a mirror that showed only what each person already feared. Jennings alone. That night, Jennings was seen walking alone down Blackthorn Lane. He stopped outside number 42, standing at the gate for several minutes. Neighbors watching through curtains said he didn't move, didn't even smoke, just stared at the dark house. Then he whispered something, too soft to hear, before turning and walking into the fog. The sheriff's notebook. That evening, Sheriff Albright wrote, "The whisper is his. It has to be. But knowing and proving are two different roads. Margaret's silence may never shout loud enough for a courtroom, and still I cannot shake the thought. If he killed Edward, if he killed Margaret, why leave the whisper at all?" The silence holds. The Holloway house stood unchanged, but everyone in town felt it. The case was circling closer to Jennings. And yet, the silence of Blackthorn Lane still held something back, as though the house itself waited for one more revelation before it gave up its final secret. The forgotten record. It was a young constable, new to the force, who stumbled on it. He had been combing through the Holloway's old telephone logs, stacks of itemized bills filed away in boxes. Most were unremarkable, calls to the grocer, the church, a cousin in Birmingham. But 3 days before Margaret's death, a call appeared from an unlisted number, 8 minutes long. No name attached, and it came late at night. The discovery detectives brought the record to the sheriff. He frowned, tapping the page. "We never traced this." "Too late?" the constable asked. "Not too late," the sheriff replied grimly. "Nothing's too late when the dead are still asking questions." Tracing the number. The number was routed through an old exchange. After hours of back and forth with the telephone company, a location emerged. A payphone on the edge of town, outside a shuttered petrol station. The kind of place where no one would notice a man whispering into the receiver at midnight. The neighbor's memory. When asked, a night watchman at a nearby lot recalled seeing a car parked by the phone that week. "Dark sedan," he said. "Windows tinted. Man inside smoking. Didn't get out until near midnight. Stood at the phone with his collar up. Didn't see his face." The cigarette. Again. The same detail Edward had written about. The same glow the neighbor's child had noticed before Margaret's death. The calls wait. 8 minutes. What could have been said in those minutes? Comfort, threat, instructions, the detectives argued. Some believed it was Jennings arranging his final visit. Others thought it was Reverend Cole or even the grocer cloaked in secrecy. But the sheriff wrote only one line in his notebook. 8 minutes is long enough to kill with words alone. The widow's silence. Margaret had not mentioned the call to anyone. No note, no trace in her scraps. Yet she had answered, spoken, listened. And then, days later, she sat in her chair with poison in her blood. The town reacts. When news of the phone call spread, Blackthorn Lane grew restless. "He called her to say goodbye," one neighbor whispered. "No," another countered. "He called to make sure she drank the tea." The truth was unknown, but the idea of a final conversation, a voice slipping through the wires in the night, turned Margaret's death into something even more intimate and more terrifying. The house in waiting. That night, number 42 seemed darker still. Some swore they heard the faint ring of a phone echoing inside, though the line had long been cut. Others said if you stood by the gate, you could hear a whisper, just at the edge of hearing, as though someone were still on the other end of the line. The connection. The discovery of the 8-minute call set detectives back on the trail of the answering machine tape. They pulled the recording once more, playing it in the dim room of the station, the whisper hissing through static. "It's done." 2 seconds. That was all. But what if the answer wasn't in the voice, but in the origin? The records aligned. The telephone company was pressed again, this time for logs surrounding March 13th, the night before Margaret was found. And there it was. Another call from the same payphone. Short, barely long enough for words. Timestamp, 9:37 p.m. The same time the answering machine had clicked alive, capturing the whisper. The realization. The sheriff sat back in his chair, his jaw tightening. "The same phone," he muttered. "The same man. He calls her for 8 minutes, then days later he calls again, only to leave her death notice on tape." It was no longer theory. The whisper wasn't some ghostly message. It had come from flesh and blood, from a payphone on the edge of town. The cigarette again. Detectives returned to the night watchman's testimony. The sedan, the smoke curling in the dark, the man with his collar pulled up. Always the cigarette. Always the shadow. Whoever he was, he carried the same habits across years. From Edward's complaints in his diary, to the glow the child saw outside Margaret's home, to the man at the payphone. The town's murmurs. When word spread, fear sharpened into anger. "Someone in this town killed them both," a man spat at the diner, "and he's still walking free." Others muttered about Jennings, about the Reverend, about Talbot. Names passed like contagion, each one leaving a mark. And yet, no one admitted to owning a dark sedan. The sheriff's notebook. That night, Sheriff Albright wrote, "The whisper is no longer mystery. It came from the payphone. That means planning, intention, and arrogance. He wanted her death confirmed, sealed in her own machine. Who leaves a signature on their crime unless they want to be heard? Unless they want to remind us that silence belongs to them." Blackthorn Lane in shadow. That evening, the Holloway house stood under heavy clouds. The street lamp flickered, its glow reaching only the gate. Some swore the faint smell of smoke drifted again, though no one was near, and others claimed the phone inside the house rang once, faintly, though its line was long dead. The lead. For weeks, the third man had been a ghost, a voice, a shadow, a cigarette ember glowing in the night. But now there was something tangible, a car, a dark sedan, tinted windows. Parked by the payphone on March 13th, it was more than rumor, It was a trace of rubber on the road, a registration in a ledger. The search detectives canvassed the town registry. Only a handful of residents owned sedans that matched the description. 3 names stood out. Arthur Jennings, a black Vauxhall, polished, well-kept. Thomas Brandt, a dented Ford Cortina, dark green, rarely seen outside his garage. Reverend Cole, a church-owned vehicle, navy blue, used for parish errands. Each man in some way was already caught in Margaret's shadow. Jennings questioned again. When asked, Jennings leaned back in his chair, smiling. Yes, I own a Vauxhall. You've seen me drive it to church. Everyone has. I've nothing to hide. But when pressed about the night of March 13th, his answer was cooler. I was home, alone. If you'd like me to invent a witness, I can't. The dead make poor alibis. His charm only deepened suspicion. Reverend Cole's defense. The Reverend's sedan was older, more faded. He admitted to driving near the petrol station often, collecting supplies for the church, but on the night of March 13th. I was in prayer, he said simply. You may search the church records. I wrote my reflections that very night. The log existed. His handwriting filled it. But skeptics muttered, a man who writes sermons can write lies. Brandt's silence. Thomas Brandt, the tradesman, was more difficult. His Ford Cortina matched the description least, but when asked where he was that night, he shrugged. Out, he muttered. Doesn't matter where. The smell of smoke clung faintly to his jacket. The town's suspicion news spread faster than the investigators could contain it. Neighbors pointed fingers, each convinced of their own culprit. At the pub, men muttered, Jennings, too polished. Too close. At church, whispers fell on Reverend Cole. Too convenient. Always at her side. And by the garages, others grumbled, Brandt, always lurking, always smoking. The town became a jury without a judge, each conversation another verdict. The sheriff's burdened Sheriff Albright, reviewing the files, felt the walls close in. 3 men, 3 cars, 3 shadows that could fit the same outline. But one truth gnawed at him most. Whoever sat in that sedan, parked by the payphone, had whispered death into Margaret's home. And he was still out there, blending into the town like an ordinary face. Blackthorn Lane at night. That evening, neighbors swore they saw headlights pause outside number 42. A dark car idled for several minutes before vanishing into the fog. The house stood silent, but its windows reflected faint streaks of light, as though remembering the glow. The plan. The payphone at the edge of town had become the story's pivot. From there, the final call to Margaret had been placed, and from there, the whisper, "It's done," had traveled into her answering machine. The sheriff ordered a stakeout. 2 unmarked cars, 3 detectives, and a long, silent wait. If the man had used the phone before, perhaps he would return. The long night march turned to April. The nights were cold, the fog thick. The payphone stood under a single flickering lamp, its booth streaked with rust. From their cars, detectives watched. Hours passed. Cigarettes burned low. The only sound was the distant hum of traffic on the motorway. The first car. Just after midnight, headlights swept across the lot. A dark sedan slowed, turned in, and rolled to a stop. The detectives held their breath. The door opened. But it was only a young man, coat pulled tight, who stepped out, coins in hand. He made a quick call, a girlfriend, a quarrel patched up in hushed tones, and drove away. False alarm. The second car. An hour later, another car appeared. Older, dented. It parked without headlights, rolling in silently. The detectives gripped their radios. The driver lit a cigarette. Smoke curled inside the car. But then, just as suddenly, the engine started again. The car pulled out and disappeared into the fog without the door ever opening. "Brant," one detective muttered. "Had to be. Only he smokes like that." But no license plate was caught. No face seen. The third car. Near dawn, the lot fell quiet. Then a third vehicle approached. This time, it was Jennings's Vauxhall. Recognizable, polished. It pulled into the petrol station lot, idled for 5 minutes, and then left without anyone stepping out. The detectives exchanged uneasy glances. "Two suspects in one night," the sheriff muttered, "both dancing around the phone, but neither daring to touch it." The realization. By sunrise, the stakeout ended without an arrest. But one truth grew clear. The men under suspicion, Jennings, Brant, maybe even the Reverend, all knew the payphone was important, and all of them circled it like moths around a flame. The town's fear. When whispers of the stakeout reached Blackthorn Lane, fear deepened. "They're watching the wrong place," one neighbor said. "The killer doesn't need a phone anymore. He's already in our houses." Another shook her head. "Or maybe he goes back because he wants to be caught. Maybe the whisper isn't just a signature. It's a dare." The house waits. That night, the Holloway house loomed darker still, as though listening for another call that would never come. Neighbors swore they heard a faint ring in the distance. Not from the payphone, not from their homes, but carried on the night air itself. 3 short chimes, then silence. The attic search. The Holloway house had been combed a dozen times, yet every search revealed something overlooked. One damp morning, detectives climbed into the attic, a space thick with dust and the smell of cedar. Boxes sagged with old school books, faded clothes, Christmas ornaments. At the bottom of one box, beneath a stack of Edward's work papers, they found a cassette tape in a cracked plastic case. It was unmarked. The tape recorder. Back at the station, the detectives threaded the tape into an old machine. Static hissed, then voices emerged, faint but distinct. First Margaret's, calm, weary. "You can't keep coming here." Then Edward's, sharp, defensive. I know. He's been in this house. Don't lie to me, Margaret." Her voice again, trembling. "It isn't what you think." And then, another voice. Male, rough, lower than Edward's. "It's exactly what he thinks." The silence. After the recording ended abruptly, as if the tape had been snatched out mid-confrontation. The room where detectives listened fell silent. 3 voices, captured in one frame of time. Edward, Margaret, and the unknown man. Proof the third wasn't paranoia. He was real, standing inside the Holloway house, speaking aloud. The sheriff's reaction. Sheriff Albright leaned forward, hands gripping the desk. "That's him. That's our ghost." But the problem was the same. The voice was too short, too distorted by static. It could belong to Jennings, or Reverend Cole, or even Brant. A shape without a face, a whisper without a name. The neighbors' rumors. When the tape's existence leaked, Blackthorn Lane buzzed with dread. "He was in the house," Mrs. Leary whispered. "Not just at the gate. Inside." A young man at the pub muttered, "If the tape ends there, maybe Edward didn't die of a heart attack at all. Maybe the recorder caught his last argument alive." Rumor fed rumor, until the town saw the Holloway home less as a house and more as a stage where death had rehearsed itself twice. The weight of betrayal. The tape didn't solve the case, but it painted the Holloways' last years in darker colors. Edward had known. Margaret had known. And the third man hadn't just existed. He had spoken, confident, unashamed, inside their walls. It meant Edward's death might not have been sudden. It meant Margaret's might not have been her choice. It meant betrayal had sat at the Holloway's table like a permanent guest. Blackthorn Lane at night. That evening, neighbors swore they heard faint static drifting from the Holloway house, as though the recorder still played upstairs. Others claimed the window light flickered in rhythm. 3 voices, 3 shadows, caught in endless replay. The lab. The unmarked cassette was sent to the regional forensics lab. The tape was fragile, edges warped with age, but the technicians coaxed it back to life, feeding it through digital filters. First, the static peeled away. Then the voices grew sharper. Margaret, you can't keep coming here. Edward, I know. He's been in this house. Don't lie to me, Margaret. Margaret again, shaking. It isn't what you think. And then the third man, not distorted now. Clear, deep. It's exactly what he thinks. The breath behind the voice. But the technicians found something else. Between the words, faint breaths, rough, labored, a smoker's rasp. And beneath those breaths, almost inaudible, a low chuckle, not mirthful, possessive, as though he enjoyed being caught. The detective's reaction. The detectives listened in silence. Some leaned forward, pale. Others shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to meet one another's eyes. One muttered, "That's Jennings." Another countered, "No, that's Brandt." A third whispered, "It could be the Reverend. The cadence. The weight." The sheriff slammed his hand on the desk. "It could be any of them." That's the damnation of whispers. The chilling discovery. In the final seconds of the tape, almost lost in static, the technicians uncovered one more sound. A whisper, separate from the others, unscripted, detached. "You'll drink what I give you." Margaret never replied. The recording cut off. The implications. If the voice belonged to Jennings, then Edward had been right all along, betrayal sitting in his chair. If it belonged to Brandt, then the man had hidden in plain sight, a tradesman slipping into homes without suspicion. If it belonged to Reverend Cole, then the betrayal was deeper still. A man of God delivering poison with prayer. None of the answers felt safe. The town reacts. When whispers of the enhanced tape reached Blackthorn Lane, panic rippled. "They caught him on tape," one neighbor said. "The killer, his voice." But another shook her head. "If they can't name him after hearing him, then it could be any man. Any of ours." "How do you live knowing that?" Paranoia thickened. Women eyed husbands. Friends eyed friends. Every cough, every laugh, every rasp of smoke sounded guilty. The house waits. That night, the Holloway home seemed heavier, its windows reflecting pale moonlight like eyes. Neighbors swore they heard faint voices drifting from inside, though the house was empty. 3 voices, always 3. The summons. On a damp morning in late April, Arthur Jennings walked into the station, summoned for clarification of evidence. He arrived without protest, dressed neatly as ever, his black Vauxhall parked conspicuously outside. He greeted the desk clerk by name, tipped his hat to a constable, and sat calmly at the table in the interview room. "You've been circling me long enough," he said evenly. "Let's stop dancing." The tape-played detectives started with the cassette. They pressed play, letting the enhanced voice fill the room. "It's exactly what he thinks." And then softer, almost lost, "You'll drink what I give you." Jennings leaned back, his expression unreadable. "That's supposed to be me?" he asked finally. "Do you deny it?" I deny nothing and confess nothing. Whispers are a mirror. You hear what you want. If you think it's me, it is. If you think it's someone else, it is. The dead don't correct us. The ledger. Next came the ledger. His handwriting, his entries. Jennings chuckled. Yes, I helped. Margaret trusted me. Edward trusted me. I wrote numbers in a book. And now you call that poison? My God, what poverty of imagination. The 8-minute call. They confronted him with the unlisted number, the 8-minute phone call. He raised his brows. So she spoke to someone. Does that prove murder? Or does it prove a lonely woman wanted company? Company that ended her life, the sheriff snapped. Jennings smiled thinly. Perhaps her life ended because she lost that company. The shift. The room grew tense. Jennings's calmness felt rehearsed, too smooth. But then something cracked. When one detective muttered, "Edward was right about you," Jennings's smile faltered. His eyes flashed, his hand pressed flat against the table, hard. Edward's words had always been the thorn. Jennings could not pluck it out without bleeding. The disturbing turn. Then, in a low voice, Jennings leaned forward. "You think Margaret was a victim," he said softly. "But maybe she drank because she wanted to. Maybe she asked. Did you think of that?" Silence filled the room. "Are you saying she chose death?" the sheriff demanded. Jennings leaned back, his composure returning. "I'm saying you can't prosecute whispers, nor scraps of paper, nor lonely hearts. If you want to call me guilty, do it, but you'll never prove it. Because Margaret took her truth with her." The aftermath. The session ended without confession, without charges. Jennings walked out of the station, his smile intact, his steps steady. But the detectives felt hollow. He had not admitted guilt, yet somehow he had left the impression of a man who enjoyed their helplessness, as if the silence itself were his ally. Blackthorn Lane. Watches. That night, neighbors saw Jennings drive slowly past number 42, his sedan idling at the gate before pulling away. One swore his window was down, smoke curling into the night. Another claimed they heard a whisper drift across the lane. It's done. A change in direction. The Jennings interrogation had left the detectives frustrated, hollow, and no closer to resolution. His words were slippery, his composure ironclad. Every shadow in the case seemed to lead back to him, but that almost made it too neat. The sheriff ordered the team to widen their scope again. "If we keep staring at Jennings, we'll go blind," he muttered. "Look at the Reverend." The visits reconsidered. Reverend Nathaniel Cole had always defended his closeness to Margaret as pastoral duty. He visited after Edward's funeral, prayed with her, listened to her grief. But detectives discovered his visits were more frequent than first believed. Parish records showed evenings unaccounted for, time that was not logged with church matters, and some of Margaret's neighbors remembered his car parked by her gate long after dark. She needed company, one parishioner admitted reluctantly, but not all company is holy. The parish housemaid. A young housemaid at the rectory, Anna Fields, came forward hesitantly. She recalled overhearing a tense conversation between the Reverend and Margaret over the phone. "She said, 'You mustn't call anymore,'" Anna whispered. "And his voice, it wasn't gentle. It was sharp." Like she had crossed him. The letters. In Margaret's fragments, detectives now noticed lines that could fit the Reverend as easily as Jennings. "He promised I'd never be alone. But promises are chains. If kindness comes with poison, then what is cruelty? Could kindness have meant pastoral comfort that curdled into possession?" The Reverend questioned again. Brought back in, Reverend Cole clasped his hands and spoke softly. I loved Margaret as a soul in pain. Nothing more. If you twist compassion into lust or murder, then it is you who sins, not I. But his eyes flickered when detectives asked about the phone calls. He insisted his last words to her were of prayer, not poison. When pressed about the tape, he shook his head. Voices deceive. Static lies. Only God knows the truth. The town reacts. The town split yet again. For some, the Reverend's defense rang true. A man of God unfairly dragged into suspicion. But for others, his proximity to Margaret now looked like obsession cloaked in scripture. One parishioner murmured, "If a priest can whisper poison, then we are all damned." The sheriff's notebook. That night, Sheriff Albright wrote, "Jennings is guilty in shadow. The Reverend is guilty in silence. Both lived inside her life. Both could have poured the tea. Both could have whispered death into her line." He underlined the final line 3 times. The third man may not be a stranger. He may be two. Blackthorn Lane in silence. That evening, as mist rolled down the lane, some swore they heard a hymn drifting faintly from number 42, low, mournful, as though sung by a voice that didn't belong to the living. Others said smoke curled once more from the dark chimney, though no fire was lit. The paper trail. Margaret Holloway had never been wealthy, but she managed Edward's modest estate carefully. Detectives returned to her bank statements, looking again with new eyes. Among the routine expenses, groceries, gas, household supplies, were several checks written to St. Agnes Parish. At first glance, they seemed ordinary. Tithes, donations. But the amounts were unusual. Not the quiet 10 tans or 20 palos most parishioners gave, but hundreds, sometimes more than 500 talers at a time, and always the checks were marked only for the Reverend's work. Beyond tithing. One detective frowned. That's not a widow's tithe. That's support. Regular. Significant. The pattern suggested Margaret was funneling money directly into Reverend Cole's hands. Whether out of devotion, obligation, or coercion was the question. When compared to her withdrawals for Jennings's help, the picture grew murkier. 2 men, both drawing from her life in different ways. The parish accountant. When questioned, the church's volunteer bookkeeper confirmed the donations, but hesitated. Yes, she gave. Quite a lot. But she asked that it not be announced in services. She wanted it quiet. Quiet why? The woman lowered her eyes. Because the Reverend asked her to keep it between them. The Reverend confronted. When detectives pressed Reverend Cole, his tone sharpened. Margaret was generous. She wanted her grief turned into good. She asked me how, and I guided her. The money was for the church, for God's work. But it wasn't in church records, the sheriff countered. Cole's jaw tightened. Some offerings are meant for heaven, not for ledgers. The evasiveness only deepened suspicion. The town reacts. When whispers of the financial tie spread, the congregation fractured. She supported the church, one parishioner said firmly. That's no sin. But another shook her head. It wasn't the church. It was him. She paid for his silence, or for his presence. Either way, it's not holy. Rumor painted Reverend Cole not as a shepherd, but as a man binding Margaret through guilt, money, and perhaps more. The fragments revisited. Detectives reread Margaret's scraps with this in mind. He promised I'd never be alone. But promises are chains. If kindness comes with poison, then what is cruelty? What if promises had meant her secret donations? What if chains meant the weight of obligation, financial and emotional? And what if the poison was both literal and metaphorical. The sheriff's notebook. That night, Sheriff Albright wrote, "Two men fed from her life, Jennings with trust, Cole with faith. Both gained from her silence. Both left her poorer, lonelier, weaker. Perhaps both are guilty. Perhaps one watched while the other poured." The house darkens. That evening, number 42 Blackthorn Lane seemed to groan with the weight of its secrets. Neighbors swore the curtains moved, though no one was inside, and some claimed that if you pressed your ear to the door, you could hear coins clinking faintly, as though offerings were still being counted in the dark. The solicitor's envelope. Margaret Holloway had always been careful with her papers. Her solicitor, Mr. Havers, had filed a will for her shortly after Edward's death, leaving the Holloway home and modest savings to distant cousins in Birmingham. But in late February, only weeks before her death, she walked into his office with trembling hands and requested a revision. When detectives learned this, they asked to see the file. Inside the envelope lay a new will, signed in neat, deliberate handwriting. The change. The cousins had been removed. In their place, one name appeared: Arthur Jennings. If Margaret died, the Holloway house and her remaining savings would pass to him. The room falls silent. When the detectives read the document aloud, the room went still. Jennings had not only been the family friend, the man in the garden, the shadow in the background. He now stood to inherit everything. Motive no longer lived in whispers. It sat in black ink. Jennings questioned again. Brought back in, Jennings kept his composure, though his smile was thinner now. "She asked me," he said. "She had no children, no close kin. She wanted her affairs left in the hands of someone she trusted. I refused at first, but she insisted. What would you have me do? Spit on her kindness?" The sheriff's voice was low. "Kindness doesn't usually end in poison." Jennings leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "You can accuse me of shadows and scraps, Sheriff, but a will is not murder. It's trust made legal. If you want to twist it, that's on you." The town explodes. When news spread, the town erupted. "Of course it's him," shouted one man at Gallagher's diner. "He killed Edward, then waited for Margaret to sign her life away before finishing her too." Others shook their heads. "Maybe she loved him. Maybe she wanted him to have it." "Doesn't make him a killer." The lane itself felt divided down the middle. Half convinced Jennings had orchestrated everything, half clinging to the belief that coincidence wasn't proof. Margaret's silence. The scraps of Margaret's writing now read differently. "He promised I'd never be alone, but promises are chains. If kindness comes with poison, then what is cruelty?" Were those the words of a woman coerced into rewriting her legacy, or the conflicted thoughts of someone who had chosen affection, even if dangerous? The truth felt as tangled as the ink. The sheriff's notebook. That night, Sheriff Albright wrote, "Motive is here. Jennings gains everything. The will is the rope around Margaret's neck. But why leave a whisper on tape? Why circle the payphone like a moth to flame? Unless he wanted us to know and laugh at our helplessness." The house tightens. That evening, number 42 seemed almost to sag beneath the weight of its betrayal. Neighbors swore they saw a man's silhouette in the upstairs window, but when police entered, the rooms were empty. The will sat locked in the station's cabinet, yet it felt as though the house already knew. Building the case. By early May, the Holloway file was thick with evidence. Enough, the detectives believed, to finally bring charges. Edward's diary naming a third man. Margaret's fragments, hinting at betrayal. The enhanced tape with a male voice commanding, "You'll drink what I give you." The payphone calls tied to a dark sedan, the ledger entries in Jennings's own handwriting, and now, the will, leaving him the Holloway estate. One by one, the pieces pointed to Arthur Jennings. The sheriff gathered his team. It won't be an easy trial, but we have motive, opportunity, and his shadow in every corner of their lives. We're ready. The prosecutors doubt. But when the case file landed on the desk of the county prosecutor, doubt cut through the triumph. Circumstantial, she said firmly. Every page. You have smoke but no fire. A jury will see whispers and grief, not guilt. Without a confession or a witness or hard physical evidence, this case collapses. The words felt like ice water poured over flame. The twist. That night, before the detectives could regroup, a call came in. Jennings had been found, collapsed in his Vauxhall, parked by the very same petrol station payphone. A cigarette burned down to ash in his fingers. By the time paramedics arrived, he was gone. The autopsy. The coroner's report was swift and cruelly familiar. Jennings had died of acute cardiac arrest. No wounds, no signs of struggle, but in his blood, traces of digitalis, the same poison that had killed Margaret. The sheriff's fury. Sheriff Albright slammed his fist on the table. Damn it! He was ours. We had him, and now he's gone. One detective whispered the thought none wanted to say. Or maybe he wasn't the killer at all. Maybe he was the next victim. The room fell silent. The town in chaos news of Jennings's death spread like fire. For half the town, it was proof of guilt. He killed them both, and poison claimed him in turn. For the other half, it was proof of innocence. He was silenced, just like them, because he knew too much. Blackthorn Lane became a street divided. Suspicion now floating freely without anchor, the sheriff's notebook. That night, the sheriff wrote, Jennings is dead. If guilty, justice is gone with him. If innocent, the real killer still walks free. 3 Holloways, 3 deaths, all the same poison. The river of silence flows on, and we have no dam to stop it. The house holds its breath. Number 42 stood darker than ever. Now 3 ghosts lingered in its shadow. Edward, Margaret, Jennings. Some swore the upstairs window glowed faintly that night, though the house had no electricity running. Others claimed the phone inside rang once more, just after midnight. 1 ring, then silence. The collapse. Jennings's death should have ended the story. For many in town it did. Justice by poison, balance restored. But for the detectives, it shattered everything. If Jennings was guilty, who poisoned him? And if he was innocent, who had orchestrated all 3 deaths? The file was no longer a case. It was a curse. Revisiting the Reverend. They called Reverend Cole in again, this time not as a suspect alone, but as a man whose shadow stretched across too many graves. His answers were calm, as always. He spoke of Margaret with reverence, of Edward with respect, of Jennings with pity. But his voice carried a rasp that the sheriff couldn't ignore. 3 deaths, the sheriff pressed. All poison, all close to you. Cole's lips tightened. All close to God as well. You confuse providence with guilt. Brandt's silence. Thomas Brandt, the tradesman, was rougher. When questioned, he spat tobacco into a tin and glared. You keep circling me like wolves. I didn't touch that widow, or her husband, or Jennings. You want to kill her? Look in the mirror. You hounded the man till his heart gave out. But when detectives searched his garage, they found empty pill bottles in the trash, bottles once holding digitalis. Brandt shrugged. My mother's, dead 10 years, junk I never threw out. The coincidence was too sharp to ignore. The wider net. The coroner, weary from 3 autopsies, finally spoke aloud what others had whispered. This is no random pattern. This is practiced. Whoever did this knows how to use poison, how to measure, how to leave just enough doubt. Detectives began checking regional reports, and there, in a neighboring county, they found two more suspicious deaths, both sudden, both elderly, both dismissed as natural until whispers of digitalis appeared. Two more deaths, two more chairs, two more silences. The realization, the third man, was not just Margaret's shadow. He was a pattern. A man who slipped into lives with trust, left cups of tea cooling, and walked away while silence swallowed the truth. Jennings had fit the role too neatly, perhaps too obviously. But the true killer? He might still be walking freely. Perhaps Reverend Cole, perhaps Brant, or perhaps someone whose name had never yet been spoken. The Sheriff's Notebook. That night, Sheriff Albright wrote, "The case has no edges anymore. Jennings is gone, but the poison remains. If Brant, then a tradesman. If Cole, then a priest. If neither, then a ghost in plain sight. The truth is not narrower. It is wider, too wide to hold. Blackthorn Lane at night. Number 42 was silent, but the lane no longer trusted its own shadows. A widow, a husband, a family friend, all gone. And yet the smell of smoke drifted faintly once more through the hedges, as though someone still lingered. Watching. Waiting. The case unravels. By summer, the Holloway file had swollen into chaos. 3 deaths, dozens of suspects, and evidence that pointed in every direction at once. Jennings was dead, poisoned like Margaret. Brant was cornered, but no proof could pin him down. Reverend Cole was shadowed, his voice too close to the whispers, his ties too intimate. And through it all, the sheriff saw his team wither. They no longer argued guilt. They argued exhaustion. "Every road leads to fog," one detective muttered, slamming the file shut. The town turns. The people of Blackthorn Lane, once silent, grew restless. Neighbors whispered accusations across hedges. Parishioners eyed their priest with suspicion. Shopkeepers watched Brant's every move. Rumors bloomed into certainty. Jennings killed Edward. No, Cole killed Margaret. No, Brant's the poisoner. The truth mattered less than the pointing of fingers. The widow's house number 42 became a symbol. Some left flowers at the gate, treating Margaret as a martyr. Others crossed themselves when they passed, as if the house itself were cursed. Children dared each other to touch the door. None lingered long. They swore the handle burned cold. At night, neighbors said lights flickered in the windows, though the house had been disconnected from power. Some claimed to hear a woman's voice faintly calling, though others swore it was only the wind. Fear like smoke. Fear became a presence on the lane, as tangible as fog. Women refused to open their doors after dark. Men carried knives in their pockets, glancing over shoulders. Even the postman muttered prayers as he delivered mail. And still, now and then, the smell of smoke curled through the air, as if the third man still walked the hedges, unseen. The sheriff's breaking point. Sheriff Albright stood in the station one evening, staring at the wall of evidence. Edward's diary, Margaret's fragments, Jennings's ledger, Reverend Cole's donations, Brant's pill bottles. Every scrap pointed to guilt, and none were enough. He whispered to himself, "The truth isn't in these pages. It's in the silence, and silence doesn't confess." The town fractures. That week, a fight broke out at Gallagher's diner. Brant accused Cole of manipulation. Cole accused Brant of cruelty. Their voices rose until fists followed. It took 3 men to pull them apart, each shouting the other's name as murderer. For the first time, Blackthorn Lane didn't just fear the third man. It began to believe the third man could be anyone, even themselves. The Waiting House. Number 42. Holloway Lane remained empty, but its presence grew heavier with each passing day. Some swore they saw three figures in the window: Edward, Margaret, Jennings, standing together in silence, watching. Others said a fourth shadow now lingered behind them, taller, darker, faceless. The third man. The case closes. By autumn, the Holloway file was returned to the archives, its edges worn, its pages thick with contradictions. Officially, Margaret's death remained unclassified: accident, suicide, or murder. Edward's death, still stamped natural. Jennings' death, poison, but unresolved. The sheriff signed the last report with a heavy hand. The words felt hollow even as he wrote them. Case suspended. No further action. The sheriff's last visit. One evening, Sheriff Albright walked alone down Blackthorn Lane. He stopped at number 42, the Holloway house, its shutters tight, its gate rusting. He placed his hand on the fence and whispered, "I'm sorry." For Edward, who had seen betrayal but not believed. For Margaret, who had known but not spoken. For Jennings, guilty or innocent, who had died with secrets still clenched tight. The sheriff knew the truth might still live inside the walls, but the walls would never speak. The town's memory. The people of Blackthorn Lane carried on, though never the same. The lane grew quieter, houses more withdrawn. At the pub, whispers lingered, but no one dared speak the case aloud for long. Children grew up hearing warnings. Don't linger near number 42. Don't follow strangers with smoke on their breath. Don't answer whispers in the night. The Holloway deaths became folklore, retold in hushed voices, stripped of names until they became symbols. The husband, the widow, the friend, and the third, always the third. The house that waits. Number 42 remained empty. Realtors tried to sell it. Buyers walked through, but none stayed. They complained of drafts, of strange smells, of the sense of being watched. At night, passers-by swore the windows glowed faintly. Some claimed to hear faint static drifting from inside, as though the answering machine still played. Others swore the phone rang once, exactly at 9:37 p.m., the same time the whisper was left. And always, always, the smell of cigarette smoke clung faintly to the hedges. The silence that endures. In the end, the Holloway mystery was never solved. Not by the sheriff, not by the neighbors, not by the files that stacked higher with each unanswered question. But the silence it left behind became its own answer. A silence that carried weight, like footsteps just behind. A silence that watched from windows. A silence that whispered in the dark of Blackthorn Lane, "It's done." And that is the end of The Widow of Blackthorn Lane. A story not of resolution, but of haunting, where trust curdled into betrayal and silence became the only truth left behind. If you've stayed with us through every part of this journey, thank you. Don't forget to subscribe for more true crime bedtime stories, because sometimes the darkest mysteries are the ones that never find an answer. And as you drift into sleep tonight, remember, the silence around you may not be empty. Good night.